All right, well, the first two presentations have raised a lot of questions for future research, so hopefully people are taking notes and those can come back up this afternoon in the listening session. We're going to move further west now to Jennifer McAdam from Utah State, and Jennifer will be discussing enhanced forage intake and milk production on Birdsfoot Trefoil pastures in the western U.S. Welcome.
Thank you. So when our dairy producers were not organic valley producers, they were just grass-based dairy producers, I got interested in Birdsfoot Trefoil because they were importing not just the system, but the forages from New Zealand, and so they were trying to graze perennial ryegrass and white clover. And so in our environment, we have a higher pH soil, and the white clover was taking over in those pastures, and they were having to deal with bloat. So I knew from my graduate work at Missouri about Birdsfoot Trefoil and the fact that it had tannins and therefore it didn't cause bloat. So that's the inflorescence on the left, and on the right here you can see the shape of the pods that gives it its name Birdsfoot Trefoil. So in 2009, McBride and Green published an ERS report that provided a nice rationale for the economic side of what we were interested in doing with organic dairy producers, where they compared the 25% of organic dairies that fed the most grain with the 25% that fed the least grain, the most pasture. And they found that the feed costs with the pasture-based dairies, organic dairies, was 25% less, but the production was 30% less. And so we wanted to help address that and wondered if we couldn't do that by changing the pastures. A study published from New Zealand, where of course they do a lot of grazing-based dairying, in 2009 suggested that Birdsfoot Trefoil could help address this in pastures. And so the 4 treatments are in the red box across the top. So we're comparing 0% Birdsfoot Trefoil in perennial ryegrass pastures with 15, 29, or 45% Birdsfoot Trefoil in those pastures. And if we look at the milk yield, we see that on straight perennial ryegrass pastures, there is lower production, up to a 29% increase with 45% Birdsfoot Trefoil in the pasture. And I was looking at your rolling herd averages yesterday, and this is in the same range as your organic herd average. And so why is this? Well, if we look at the leaves of legume forages versus the leaves of grass forages, in the grasses, and especially in tall fescue, it's pretty obvious. You can see these ridges, and those are long strands of the fiber that we talk about with ruminant nutrition. And in the legume leaves, that fiber is in short strands. In grasses, it's in very long strands. Plus, there's just more of it. And so if we look at the nutritive value of Birdsfoot Trefoil versus tall fescue, and that's in the table at the bottom, we see that Birdsfoot Trefoil has about 54% fiber, or NDF, while tall fescue, a typical grass, has about 70%. The ADF values are about the same, but the protein is higher in Birdsfoot Trefoil, and fiber is protein is very digestible. So that increases the digestibility, which increases the intake. So that's a comparison of a grass with a legume forage. If we compare different legume forages, as we could compare Birdsfoot Trefoil and alfalfa, and look at the structure of Birdsfoot Trefoil. This drawing is from a Penn State agronomy bulletin, and it shows just a few of the stems of Birdsfoot Trefoil. And you can see here in the center, the artist has sort of cut off all of the rest of the stems. So Birdsfoot Trefoil has many more and finer stems than alfalfa, but it still has a taproot. It's a little more fibrous than alfalfa. So if we, in the table, look at the proportion of leaf and stem, those first 2 rows, Birdsfoot Trefoil has a little higher percentage of leaf than alfalfa. Trefoil 60% leaf, 40% stem versus 54 and 45% stem in alfalfa. And then the third line there is just the digestibility of the fiber in the stem, and that is significantly different. Birdsfoot Trefoil, 53% digestibility versus alfalfa, 44% digestibility of the fiber in the stem. Van Soest looked at the relationship between the percent of cell wall constituents or fiber in forages and measured voluntary intake. And so on the higher end, we have, low fiber, low NDF, we have alfalfas from a variety of different places, including Utah. And then on the higher cell wall end, we have grasses, and the relationship is that voluntary intake goes down as NDF goes up, especially into these higher ranges. But the reason I wanted to show you this is because Van Soest in the paper made the point that Birdsfoot Trefoil was so much higher than alfalfa that he had to take it out of this analysis to draw the curve. And so Birdsfoot Trefoil in the 60s was shown already to have this higher intake with the same amount of NDF. We did a study of different Birdsfoot Trefoil varieties. We compared 14 varieties, and then we had 2 check varieties of alfalfa. And one of the interesting results from this variety trial was not just the amount of NDF, but the amount of non-fibrous carbohydrates that we found. So what you're looking at here on the x-axis is day of year, and so this is the beginning of June, mid-July, and the end of August. That's when we took harvest. And so those were about 6 weeks apart. And on the left, we have the fiber content. So NDF was higher for alfalfa, which is in the blue, than Birdsfoot Trefoil in the red. If we look then at the non-fibrous carbohydrates, you can see that Birdsfoot Trefoil is significantly higher on all 3 harvest dates than the alfalfa. So a graduate student of mine did a study looking at the fiber in the stems, and remember that was the difference between alfalfa and Birdsfoot Trefoil in the stems. And what we're looking at here is a cross-section about 3 inches above the soil surface, which is about the height at which you would want to graze trefoil to. So it's the largest part of the stem, and this is 10-week-old Birdsfoot Trefoil. And so it's well beyond, in maturity, the stage at which you would harvest it. The staining is for lignin, and so the outer ring that's not stained is where the sugars travel down through the plant to the rest of the plant from the leaves. The red is where water travels up, and these open cells, those are the channels that water moves through. The rest of the red tissue there is fiber, which is this kind of where the food is, but which can be hard to digest relative to other constituents in the forage. So then if we take a close-up look and we compare Birdsfoot Trefoil and alfalfa, on the left is Birdsfoot Trefoil, on the right is alfalfa. The large cells are the ones that carry water, and the small ones are really thick-walled fiber cells. And remember, the red is staining for lignin. And so you may not be able to see it. Well, you probably can see it better on this. My graduate student pointed out that there are a few cells that appear not to be heavily lignified in the fiber of the stems of alfalfa. But then if we look at the Birdsfoot Trefoil, there are many stems, many more fiber cells in the stem that are not completely lignified. And so this indicates what we saw in our study, which is that there are more highly digestible carbohydrates, not necessarily just sugars, in the stems of Birdsfoot Trefoil. So it still has the structure that it requires, although it's a thinner stem. But we think that the lignification and even the chemistry may be different. So one more rationale for using this and for explaining why we can do this and why we wanted to, the progression of bloat in cows. As you probably know, alfalfa, red clover, white clover can cause bloat, and so you don't want to graze them in pure stands or even in enriched parts of the pasture like our dairy producers found when they planted perennial ryegrass and white clover. There's a really simple test that you can do in the lab that is highly correlated with the incidence of bloat, and I just wanted to show you this to illustrate the role of tannins in preventing bloat. So bloat is basically going to happen when digestibility is very rapid in the rumen. A lot of proteins get kind of dumped into the rumen, and then the microbes are fermenting those, and gases are created. So in a rapid process, you get more gas created, but it's the foam that can be produced with this high protein content that actually triggers the rumen to close, basically, so gas can't escape and causes the cow to swell and bloat. So what we did for this test is it's reported in a paper by Rumbaugh from the 60s. You take 10 grams of the leaves, which is the highest protein part of the plant. You put them into a blender with 250 mils of buffer that is at the pH of the rumen, and then you run that for 2 minutes and pour each of those into graduated cylinders, and then look at the foam after a couple of minutes. So on the left is alfalfa with no tannin. In the middle is Birdsfoot Trefoil with 1 to 4% tannin, and on the right is sandfoin, which has 5 to 8% tannin. So what we're looking at is the level of the liquid versus the level of the foam. They started out with the same amount of liquid. So here with alfalfa is the level of the liquid, and you can see the foam level is more than the liquid level in volume. Here's the Birdsfoot Trefoil with a fairly heavy foam, but not a very tall one. And the sandfoin liquid level is here, and the foam is quite small. The other thing you can see is that there's actually precipitation taking place in the Birdsfoot Trefoil pretty rapidly, and it's just starting to take place in the sandfoin right here. So what tannins do is they link up with proteins and make a heavy enough particle that the protein-tannin combination actually precipitates and then can wash right out of the rumen and go on to be digested in the animal. So, so our case for Birdsfoot Trefoil, all tannins prevent bloat by precipitating proteins. Birdsfoot Trefoil has a relatively low tannin concentration, but it's enough to prevent bloat. And then the key is that when those tannin protein combinations get to the abomasum, so here's the esophagus, the rumen, and the pH of the rumen is close to 6. So then these protein tannin combinations wash out quickly during digestion, go through the omasum, and when they hit the abomasum, the pH is down below 3. And with Birdsfoot Trefoil tannins, that triggers the release of the proteins from the tannins where they can be digested. And so instead of using that protein to make microbial protein in the rumen, it's just digested as plant protein excuse me, in the abomasum. And so our study was to compare on-farm Birdsfoot Trefoil pastures with grass pastures and look at some of the implications. The one I'll show you is the difference in cheese quality. So on-farm, we took a 20-acre pasture and split it in half, and half was the established grass pasture, and the other half was a new Birdsfoot Trefoil pasture. And in both cases, we just put a walkway up the center with temporary fencing of each pasture type, and then the cows grazed every 12 hours, moved to a new paddock, and we measured the forage before they grazed and after they grazed to determine intake. And then a graduate student on the milk side has measured production. Here's what the Birdsfoot Trefoil pasture looked like. It was planted in late July, and the producer had, and this is all done under irrigation, but the producer had lateral roll irrigation, so he had an ideal irrigation system, sprinkler irrigation system, and he was also mechanized enough that he could go in and clip the weeds, because Birdsfoot Trefoil is not particularly competitive. That's kind of the Achilles heel of the plant when you're trying to get producers to plant it, but I'll show you on this slide the intake and the milk production in the year after planting, and then the next slide is 2013. And so the Birdsfoot Trefoil here is in blue, and the grass pasture is in red. We had, I think it was 9 cows in each of the subherds that were rotationally stocked on these pastures in each case and in each year. So you can see our data are quite variable when we're measuring what we call intake or disappearance of forage with a non-destructive method, a rising plate meter. And but you can also see that the intake is higher on Birdsfoot Trefoil, and the milk production is also higher. The other advantage that Birdsfoot Trefoil has is because it's a deep-rooted forage, it can reach water, and even under irrigation, with our heat and our high evapotranspiration, I think that plants are suboptimally supplied with water just because it's leaving faster than it can come into the plants. So these deeper rooted plants have a big advantage in just production over grasses.
And were you measuring water use for the two? No.
No, we weren't.
That would be more research.
More for me to do.
Yeah.
Yes. And so the same pattern in the second year of the study on this producer's farm. Higher intake and higher milk production. And so I'll just go back to this slide. In 2012 we measured 20% higher production, and in 2013 we measured 24% higher. And so that is going to help us reach that gap between the 25% lower feed costs and the 30% lower production, I think, with a Birdsfoot Trefoil pasture. Sure.
With regard to the staying power of the Birdsfoot Trefoil, now this is the pasture with 45% trefoil?
Oh, no, that was a study that was done in New Zealand. Ours was a monoculture.
So this is 100%, okay.
Yeah.
My question for you would be, in cases where you've seen it intermixed into other grasses and species, and you mentioned that it's not very competitive, how quickly do you see that population of trefoil decline over time?
So the question is about the competitiveness of the basically established Birdsfoot Trefoil.
Exactly.
So what we have, so when it is not competitive is when it's in the establishment phase, and it's not particularly competitive with weeds. But in a mixture with, in our studies, we've looked at tall fescue, we've looked at a grass meadow brome, that's another bunch grass, and it is stable in the mixture. And so once it's established, then it is persistent on these higher pH soils. Yes.
How about, I'm looking at the timing of things. So in the May, it doesn't seem to be that much of a difference. And if you go to the next or the previous slide, and then in June, it was different. And so if I'm looking here, the experiment was also done in June. Can you kind of speculate in regards to whether it would make sense to use it later in the season to kind of increase it compared to grass and so forth?
So the timing of this had more to do with getting the cows adjusted to the pasture before we started taking data. And so we're looking, the break here is between the first rotation through the pasture and the second. And so we measured for a much longer period in 2012 than in 2013. And so I believe here they just are in the adjustment phase, and then with the second rotation they were adjusted to the pasture, and we saw the differences, and we're measuring milk production before and after. And I failed to say that, so I appreciate your question. Should I take one more question? Or?
Sure.
Okay, did you have a question?
In Wisconsin, of course, where we have Birdsfoot Trefoil being raised, it's in a pasture mix, and I have producers anecdotally tell me that the cows don't like it. They eat everything else first. And, I mean, there's no data backing that up. It's that comments like you're hearing from farmers.
And we've grazed it, and we haven't seen that. And one of the things that I find when we look at mixtures of legumes and grasses is that with alfalfa, they can pick out the alfalfa or the grass and take or reject one or the other. With Birdsfoot Trefoil, it is so intertwined with the leaves of the grass, and it's at the same height, and you can graze it to the same height, that I don't know how they could reject it. And we have cows that graze pure stands of Birdsfoot Trefoil, just to make the point of how much difference in production we can see. And we haven't had problems with cows not consuming it or not being willing to consume it immediately that they're put on it. So I don't know why that. Yes, ma'am.
This is fascinating study, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to get more in the details on that. I have a couple of questions, maybe a comments about what was said about the intake. I have many farmers in Wisconsin telling me that they rarely consume Birdsfoot Trefoil, and the tannin content, which might be an issue with palatability, apparently the cows don't mind that. My question is about, I remember in the previous slide you had NFC, the non-fiber carbohydrates, going up as time progressed, and then I see here the milk production going down. Of course, it's nice that the Birdsfoot Trefoil do have a positive effect.
Pasture production is falling off later in the year. I think that's that, and so what I was measuring was the percent within the forage, and so while the forage is decreasing in production as we progress through the season, the proportion of those things, the proportion that is the non-fibrous carbohydrate is actually increasing, although there's less forage. Yeah. And so just I wanted to show you the omega-3 fatty acid concentration. We heard that discussed last night, I believe. And so we compared cheese made from the milk of Birdsfoot Trefoil-fed cows, grass-fed cows from our study, and then TMR-fed cows from the university dairy. And I don't think it's surprising to see that there's an increment of omega-3 fatty acid higher in the grass compared with TMR. We were interested to see that a further increment was there in the cheese made from the Birdsfoot Trefoil milk. And we also looked at CLAs, which have some anti-carcinogenic properties, and it was in our study similar to the grass milk, the cheese made from grass milk.
Was that test one-time measure, or is that an actual research that you did?
You know, we did take one sample of milk and make cheese from it, and so it was a wheel of cheese made from one type of milk and a wheel of cheese made from the other, and we have repeated that, but just once.
Do you have this data, the numbers available publicly? Do you have?
I haven't published these data, and I have the same question you have. Can you publish one wheel of cheese data?
As follow up to that, with the wheels of cheese, do you remember offhand what date range roughly you were pulling that milk out of the cows?
You know, I think it was July
Okay.
in the first year, and then I don't recall, but it was in the middle of the milk production measurements in both years.
Just because one of the things that we've seen, especially with omega-3 fatty acids, is that it's a lagging indicator. So your peak range for omega-3s in a cow is typically 1 to 2 months after the peak of your grazing season.
Oh, no, that's interesting,
So
and
you
I
may actually
did
see
not know
higher
that.
concentrations later in the season, or see some sort of complex interaction.
Okay.
You have 5 more minutes total.
Oh.
Sorry, we'll stop interrupting.
No. I have one more slide, and I think I can get through it in 5 minutes. So we did a parallel study of seeding rates because for one producer that it was a cooperator on a beef production study, we had planted Birdsfoot Trefoil, and we had planned on a normal rate, which is about 6 pounds per acre, and discovered as we were planting that we were planting at a much higher rate, 30 pounds per acre. And it was a beautiful stand. It was beautiful immediately, and it's still in. We planted it in 2009, and we took a hay crop last summer from it. And so I was determined to look at a higher seeding rate for Birdsfoot Trefoil, although it may not be economically viable. So we used organic ground, and so we used all the restrictions that you would need to use. And so what you're left with is seeding rate and a companion crop, and then fall versus spring planting. We didn't really see any differences between the spring planting and the fall planting, and we didn't take any data until the year following planting. And so in blue is the year after planting, and then red and green are the 2 years after that. And so where we did see some measurable differences was with seeding rate in the first year. So this is 3, 6, 18, and 30 pounds per acre are the 4 seeding rates that we used. There was a difference, and we took advantage of that, and we used a 20 pound per acre seeding rate when we did our organic dairy study. But those differences are gone in the second and third years after planting, even at 3 pounds per acre. So what the aphorism, I guess, is with Birdsfoot Trefoil is the first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps. And so this is the creeping year, and then the third year it leaps. And so you get your best production after a couple of years of Birdsfoot Trefoil. And then the other graph that I'll explain is the effect of the companion crop. We used an oat companion crop. We used a bushel and a half per acre, and I would recommend a lower rate now that we've done this study. And then without the companion crop, we had the companion crop of weeds. And so on the left in purple is the no companion crop, and then on the right is the companion crop. And oats is competitive enough with Birdsfoot Trefoil that it really does have an impact in the year after seeding. And so in the first year we did clip weeds, we clipped the oats, but the base part of the oats is quite competitive too. But again, in the second and third years after planting, we didn't see any difference. And there is a big difference in the amount of weediness without the companion crop. And so while it has a lasting effect on your total yield, I don't know that a companion crop is really that bad an idea, because you don't want a weed seed bank being added to in a organic production study. And I believe that is where I'm done.